Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is John Fisher with MassDEP, and I'm joined here I believe, several MassDEP staff, but in particular, Leah Kelleher, who's going to help me run the Zoom call here today and make sure folks get admitted, monitor the chat over the course of the meeting, and just kind of help me keep things on track here today. As you heard a moment ago, we are going to be recording the meeting here this afternoon. We'd like to do that to be able to share all the information that's presented here today with people who may not be able to attend. It's sometimes hard for people to make these meetings in the middle of the day, or people just have schedule conflicts. So we like to record these meetings to be able to share them more broadly and share the information out to as many stakeholders as possible. So I'll introduce myself real quickly here. I am our Deputy Division Director for Solid Waste at MassDEP. So in that role, I oversee our statewide solid waste and waste reduction programs. And I've also been working, in particular, leading our work around food waste reduction going back to 2012, especially from that point forward. So I'm really excited for this meeting this afternoon. We're going to be focusing in on food rescue and donation, and I'll kind of provide some more context around this meeting in a moment and where it fits into the broader policy development work that we're doing at MassDEP. So here's our meeting agenda here today. I'm going to start with a brief tangent at the beginning, just going to give some updates on some current and upcoming MassDEP grant offerings that are particularly timely right now. So I want to make sure that people are aware of these and have a chance to check out the grant information. I'm not going to be going into detail on any of these grant programs, but just giving you links and information that you can look to for more information and to learn more. I'll provide a little bit of context about what got us here today, some meetings that we held in 2025 that kind of got us to the point where we are, and then talk about our plan for the 2026 meetings of our organic subcommittee, including how this one fits into that. And then the bulk of our meeting here today is going to be this panel discussion around food rescue and donation. So we did something similar at our January meeting around food waste tracking and prevention systems. And I thought it was a really good format. I like the format, so I decided to try to replicate that here today. So we're going to be doing something similar here this afternoon. So that'll be the bulk of our meeting that we'll get into shortly. So first of all, before we get into that, we have 3 grant programs that are at different stages this spring at MassDEP, all of which hold some relevance to some aspect of reducing food waste. So the first is actually open right now, but if you're interested, you better hurry because it closes April 3rd. So this is our Recycling and Reuse Business Development Grant Program. This is a program that provides capital funding for all sorts of recycling, composting, and waste reduction businesses. Relative to food waste, it provides grants for processing type activities, which could be like composting, anaerobic digestion, as well as actually food donation and rescue infrastructure. Those can go up to $500,000. And then we provide collection grants for targeted materials as well that can go up to $100,000. And this cycle, food is actually the only targeted material for which we're giving collection grants. So that could be either food for rescue or donation, or food scraps that are going to composting, anaerobic digestion, things like that. So that program's open now for another week. The application's up on our website. We also are about to open our Reduce, Reuse, Repair microgrants. Leah manages that program work for us at MassDEP. Through that program, we give smaller grants up to $10,000 for various types of activities focused on reducing waste, reusing materials, repairing materials, not recycling, not composting. So everything that's kind of in our view of the hierarchy, higher up on the hierarchy. That will open in April. We have a webinar coming up shortly, and that'll be open for a month from April 15th through May 15th. So we have, I'll note, given a lot of grants around reducing wasted food and with a particular focus on donation and rescue through that grant program. So that may be of interest to some folks on the call here today. And then the third program that's also going to be opening shortly is our Sustainable Materials Recovery Program. This is our primary recycling and waste reduction grant program for municipalities and regional groups. That'll be opening on April 1st. We'll be holding a webinar on that program as well, and applications are due June 1st. There are several areas where that program interfaces with reducing food waste, including grants for collection carts, grants for drop-off equipment, larger organics capacity grants, and then our recycling dividends program, which is not a food waste program per se, but interfaces with food waste programs in a couple ways. First of all, municipalities can earn points for that program by implementing food waste reduction and diversion programs, and that helps them earn larger payments through the program. And then they can also use their program payments to reinvest in those programs to reduce food waste and to divert food material for disposal. So all of those programs are all part of the same application, along with a number of other grant categories, and that program will be being rolled out shortly. So just wanted to make sure to highlight all of these programs because they're all at really critical points, time-wise and schedule-wise, coming up this spring. So it's going to be a busy grant season for us. If you're interested in any of these, there's lots more information on our website, and you can take a look and learn more about those. Let me just pause because I'm going to kind of really move away from this to see if there's any quick questions I might be able to answer about any of those grants. Okay, super. Lots of information on the website. And for the reuse microgrants and the SMRP program, there will be webinars coming up and question and answer periods as well. So definitely opportunities to learn more. With the recycling and reuse business development grants, our question period is actually closed, but we do have a response to questions document that we have posted up on the website along with the application guidelines. So with that, I'm going to move ahead here. So if you've not been following what we've been doing in Massachusetts, we're at a bit of a pivot point with our food waste reduction work. We've had a real emphasis over the past, let's say past decade really, or even maybe as much as 15 years. We've really been focused on diverting wasted food from larger commercial and institutional generators. And we've been making really pretty good progress. We've started to shift our focus downward, focused on more medium scale food waste generators. And now we're starting to think more about how can we capture more wasted food, reduce wasted food from smaller businesses and from residents where we still have a lot of food material being disposed of into the trash. So this is kind of all set within a broad policy document in Massachusetts that we call our Solid Waste Master Plan. We recently went through a mid-course review of how we're doing with that Solid Waste Master Plan. The plan runs from 2021 through 2030. So we kind of took stock of how we're doing. And one of the areas that we looked at in particular was how we're doing on food waste and whether and how we should consider expanding our current food waste disposal ban, which currently applies to businesses and institutions that dispose of a half ton or more per week. So we've had several meetings in 2025, total of 4 meetings, talking about some of the issues involved with our food waste infrastructure, our food waste management, and getting some initial input on what people think about the potential for an expanded food waste disposal ban. In MassDEP, we actually shared a potential proposal for how that might work going forward. And, as we went through that process, there were a lot of questions raised. There were a lot of issues raised, concerns identified, all of which we felt were issues, questions, and concerns that potentially could be addressed. But we felt that all of them needed more time to be worked out, and that they also would all benefit from more discussion and more stakeholder engagement before we made any formal proposal for an expanded food waste disposal ban. So as we kind of reached the end of 2025, we said for the year ahead, we want to really have some focused discussions with stakeholders across the board on all of the issues that have been raised, or else all the concerns and questions that have been raised, and really try to get everybody with an interest here, get them to the table, whether it's in the context of an organic subcommittee meeting or in separate meetings where we can go out and talk with other groups that might have an interest in different aspects of food waste management in Massachusetts. So we decided that we would hold a series of focus meetings, each of which would be focused on specific issue areas. And I'll share those in a moment. We wanted to, try to identify all of the questions and concerns that people may have, identify what are the barriers to moving forward, what do we need to do before we can move forward more effectively, or if you want to look at the flip side of that, what are the unrealized opportunities that are out there that haven't been captured yet that could be? And what strategies should we be thinking about to successfully move forward relative to each of these issue areas? So that's the kind of discussions that we wanted to have together. Back in January, we held the first of those discussions that was focused on food waste prevention and reduction, and really in the commercial and institutional space in particular. We had a panel composed of representatives of companies that provide different food waste tracking systems, all of which enable companies to track and then in turn plan for and reduce the amount of food waste they're generating to begin with. And that was a really interesting discussion. I found it helpful. We felt we were really able to kind of dig in on some of the issues. And I thought that would make a good model going forward. So we're going to try to do something similar here today, focused on food donation and rescue. And then going forward, these are some of the other topics that we've tentatively identified as other discussion topics for our organic subcommittee to engage in over the course of the year to come. So management capacity and infrastructure, cost-effective strategies, especially as we try to work with smaller businesses, residential food waste programs with a particular focus on cities and towns, food waste in schools, which is somewhat different from all of our other food waste generators, and then trying to put that all together to come up with our kind of guiding document for food waste reduction, which is what we call our Organics Action Plan. And that document ultimately will lay out the pathway for what we do going forward. So that's what we're looking to try to accomplish over the course of 2026. No definite dates in mind here. We're going to, all of these meeting dates are to be determined at this point. We want to make sure we're going at a pace that we can adequately support and where we can adequately absorb all of the findings and the lessons from each of these meetings. So I don't want to move forward with the next meeting until I feel I've really kind of captured what I need to from the current meeting, and so on. So, I'm projecting 6 to 8 meetings of our organic subcommittee. We'll see if that's adequate or not. If we need more, we'll do more. A 9 to 12 month process potentially, but could certainly go on longer than that. And if we think we need more time, we'll take more time. It's really important that this be done right and thoroughly, and we want to take whatever time we need to do that. So those are kind of projections of how long this overall process might take, but definitely subject to change. And one other note, I'll kind of probably say this several times over the course of the call here today, but I also am open and welcoming to lots of side discussions along the way. So if there are other groups interested in these topics, my mantra when it comes to this work, when I'm when I'm focused on it in periods like this is I'll basically talk to anyone, anytime about this work within reason. But we're really open and really eager to hearing from people, and that's not just hearing from people who like what we're doing. It's hearing from people who have concerns about what we're doing, hearing from people who maybe object to what we're proposing to do, and really trying to get everyone's concerns out on the table. That's been what we've really tried to do along the way, and I think that's why we've had success up to this point, is because of processes like that. So it's something that's really important to us and serious to us, and kind of a theme of what we're trying to do over the course of the next year and beyond. Okay, so with that as background, I am going to introduce our panelists here today. We're going to hear briefly from each of them, just giving a little bit of background about their organization and what they do. And then just to kind of lay this out for you, I have three discussion questions for them to each weigh in on that we're going to start with. And then we're just going to open this up to open questions, comments, and discussion from all of you. And then, my goal is to try to capture as much recommended follow-up and strategies and action items as we can over the course of the meeting today, as well as perhaps, other topics that we need to follow up on more. So our panelists here today, Andrea Scarpolini from Cape Cod Cooperative Extension in Barnstable County, Tim Cavaretta from Food for Free, and then Jody Falk from Rachel's Table of Western Mass. There's also a Rachel's Table in Worcester, which is a separate organization. So I will turn to each of them in turn here to briefly introduce themselves and their organization and their work relative to food rescue and donation, and then we'll dive into our discussion questions. So Andrea, I will start with you and just tell me when you'd like to advance the slides here.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, John, for having me. I'm Andrea Scarpolini, Food Access Coordinator with Cape Cod Cooperative Extension. We're a department under Barnstable County Regional Government. And you can see right here, we started doing food rescue and food cleaning within the county about 5 years ago. And the reason why the county got involved is we held a bunch of focus groups with all of our community partners over a series of a few months, asking our partners to say, where do you think our food access initiatives should best be focused on? What should our priorities be at the county? And we were really wanting people to say, yes, the county should get involved in this. No, the county shouldn't get involved in that. And so a few of the top priorities came out, and it was so clear. The number one was that people were looking to us to explore food rescue and having a regional approach to that. So we've been doing that for the past few years, and it was never really our intention to hold it, but we were waiting long enough to pilot it to see if it could grab some momentum and then find some organization or some place to do it long term. Although we're still doing it and we're still very excited to be part of it. We have been growing out our gleaning program. You can see here we had a really successful gleaning program this past summer, and we're expanding it next year as well. So we're having farmers who are actually planning ahead with us to grow specifically for food pantries, as well as getting a good system in place so that when they have extra items that need to be harvested and they don't have the bandwidth to do it. The most exciting part about it is it's such a feel-good community program, and we've also included adults with disability programs. The center picture is one, it's living independently forever, and you can see Farmer Tim giving instructions on how to harvest, and then the other people on the outside pictures are community volunteers, people who work during the day but just wanted to come outside and get in the soil and help and drop off some produce to the pantries. You can go to the next one. This is just a quick picture of some of our food rescue initiatives through the year, through the past couple of years. The picture I wanted to highlight is the one in the middle, the Haitian Church. They're not able to get a Greater Boston Food Bank account, and they did open up their first food pantry to feeding the Caribbean population on the Cape, which is growing. So the Haitian Jamaican populations, they've been going and just buying food from BJ's and raising money in their church and then going to do that. But there's so much unwanted food, and we've been able to bring in a lot of food and make sure that they had the food that they needed to serve the population. They also serve the greater population, but we specifically are mindful to make sure we look at all of the different populations in the Cape and making sure they have the resources they need and save the money too. Their money can be spent better elsewhere, and instead, might as well, it's a win-win for everybody to use the food that's already there. You can go to the next one, please. Just currently, you can take a look at what we've been doing to the left. We have about 30 schedules routes a week. We use a lot of volunteers. We have a lot of organizations who they just want to know where the food is and they'll go pick up. But we also work a lot with the adults with disability programs. We have 3 or 4 different agencies. Their adults, clients like to get the pre-vocational skills. They get to have those relationships with the managers and with the staff at the stores. They love it, and then they get to go and drop it off at the pantry. So it has been such a great operation. We have about 36 different retailers who provide food, but we do have a lot of one-off accounts where people will connect and say, "Hey, we have this. Can you pick up?" We have about 90 volunteers. We probably have more volunteers than we actually have work for picking up. And so we're really looking to grow that. And we have about 50 different pantries or community-based organizations. And then there's a lot of potential on the Cape. There's a lot of fragmentation. There's a lot of different partners doing different things. But under the Sustainable Materials Recovery Program grant, we were able to really solidify our network of food rescue partners. And we have 3 different initiatives. We were finally able to hire, thanks to this grant, a part-time food rescue program manager. We also are creating a web portal to help with the tracking of the data and streamlining the pickups. And then we also are fortunate to have some consulting services with Banana Box Consulting. So we're really excited to finally get some structure and some support to expand this to the next stage. So that's it in a nutshell. Thanks, Sean. Oh, sorry. I guess it's not. Sorry. Real quick. This is in a previous grant a few years ago. We actually designed out what this online portal would look like, and these are a couple of screenshots. And so we sat with this, and this was a great way to kind of move food through and our system and be able to help organizations find the food they're looking for, find if they could get it donated. But we also ask our local food producers to donate a lot. And so this is a way to say, hey, if you want to do a flash sale, this is a great way to do it and move through the food cycle for purchasing. And then people can look specifically for beans if they're looking for that, or carrots, and be able to see, okay, how much will it cost me? Can we pay the provider first, the producer first? But if it's moving through and it's not getting sold, then we can easily move it right into food donation. So we're hoping that that really boosts our local food purchasing programs for our organizations and our schools and institutions, as well as really help find the food before it goes bad so we can divert it to the pantries and schools for free. And I think that is the last slide.
Thank you. All right. So now I will turn to Tim with Food for Free.
Hi, I'm Tim Cavaretta. I'm Senior Director of Operations at Food for Free. And we are now in our 45th year of doing food recovery and distribution in the Boston area. We started in Cambridge in 1981, and in 2021 moved to a warehouse in Somerville, which enabled us to expand our programs beyond food recovery. And I can tell you a little bit more about that. We can go to the next slide. So our mission here at Food for Free is to improve access to healthy food through establishing innovative programming and partnerships to overcome barriers and strengthen the food system. We believe access to healthy food is a fundamental right, and we envision a future where everyone in our community, regardless of age, income, or ability, has access to fresh, healthy, delicious food. The picture to the right here is of some of our founders. And they came together at a time when I think they had met at anti-nuclear protests. One of them worked at the Bread and Circus on Prospect Street near Central Square. One of them was a cook at a Mexican restaurant. They saw food being thrown away that could be going to people in need, and they got together and just started picking it up and taking it to local pantries in Cambridge. And that steadily expanded over the next 40 years. Now, where we hit the real inflection point was at the pandemic. Um, we we had a few programs get their start, but we saw tremendous growth of the need for food, and then at the same time, the support we were able to receive both from our financial donors and on the food supply side from the Greater Boston Food Bank to help us get more food out into the community with an emphasis on fresh foods, not just canned goods and pantry items, getting more fresh produce, minimally processed proteins, which were becoming even, at the beginning of the pandemic, more expensive. And those were the items that were in the highest demand that we were hearing from our partners. We can go to the next slide here. So, in our current food recovery program, as I mentioned, this was the bulk of our work from 1981 through 2020. Um, we, in our most recent fiscal year, picked up nearly 1.9 million pounds of food from 45 donor locations, and we currently serve 68 partner distribution sites in the Boston area. So we have partners in the northern and eastern neighborhoods of Boston, going through Allston, Brighton, down to Roxbury, Dorchester, and then out to East Boston, Charlestown as well. We serve Cambridge, Somerville, Chelsea, and Revere as well. Um, and a number of our food donors, the relationships are managed through the Greater Boston Food Bank's Enabling Program. So this mostly includes regional or national chains that have uh, agreements with Feeding America, which are then brokered by GBFB locally. And they help to bring some order to the food recovery ecosystem by part assigning different partner organizations to pick up on different days. So we're not fighting with spoonfuls or Food Link over the same foods on a given day from the same markets. So that program allows us to pick up a lot of great food from Trader Joe's, Amazon Fresh, Stop and Shop, and Star Market. So we're really grateful for our partnership with GBFB to have access to all of that food that we can share with our recipient partners. Right now, we have 6 vehicles in our fleet and at least 5 routes daily. 3 of those are dedicated almost exclusively to food recovery. While right now it's not the majority of the food that we distribute by weight, it is what takes our logistics specialists the most work every day. A lot of this food is going to be hand loaded onto trucks, going around to our recipient locations. Each of them serve different communities. They have different preferences with the kind of food. Some have a greater preference for individually wrapped prepared foods. People don't have to take home and cook. So our employees get to know the personnel at the different recipient partner locations that they go to, and they're able to customize the deliveries at each location. We can go to the next slide. And so we focus on different categories of food. So we have our traditional groceries that, we're going to, as I mentioned, Trader Joe's, Whole Foods, um, and others. So we'll collect their fresh produce, proteins, shelf-stable foods. Some of those locations also have prepared foods. We additionally get prepared foods from some institutional food service locations. So Harvard Business School will occasionally have events or places that have on-site cafes where they will stock them with freshly made sandwiches or salads every day. We'll get the day old, which is still fine to distribute. We do collect bulk trays, although not in the quantities that we used to. Those are suitable for one or two of our partners that do a hot meal service. Previously, we had a program where we were collecting bulk prepared foods and repackaging them into single serve meal trays. The logistics of that program were tremendously complicated, and unfortunately, the cost structure was such that it didn't make sense for us to continue with that one, starting with the previous fiscal year. We had mostly university dining halls packaging food in large zipper bags, freezing it, and then our volunteers would chip apart the frozen food. I mean, literally with chisels and mallets. So ergonomically not optimal. And then also the packaging came at a cost. And, that's a lot of virgin plastic, which then becomes waste. It just overall at every step that we had to put into that made those individual meals overall cost about three times what you would pay for something similar at Trader Joe's. So while we really wanted to keep this good, prepared food out of the waste stream, that turned out to not be a viable way to do it. So that just highlights some of the challenges that we do face in our food recovery efforts. I'll also mention, we rescue from trade shows. We were just at the Seafood Expo North America a couple of weeks ago, and we also will be going to the New England Restaurant and Bar Show and the New England Produce Council's Expo coming up in the fall. And we get thousands of pounds of food that we're then able to distribute to our partners that week. We also will go around Harvard and BU in particular when they have their end of semester kitchen cleanouts. We're able to recover the ingredients in their walk-ins and pantries. Some of it is institutionally sized and might not be of much use to our partners, but we do get a lot of good fresh produce and unused ingredients that won't make it till the next semester. So you can see one of our trucks at Harvard's Annenberg Dining Hall. We look forward to that. Just a little bit about Food for Free's other programs. We, with the food that we're able to get from the Greater Boston Food Bank and Boston area gleaners, we distribute about 1,000 grocery boxes each week and several dozen mixed bulk pallets of fresh produce. So that has eclipsed our food recovery program in terms of like the total weight distributed. Similarly, our school-based markets have a lot of fresh produce, but some additional pantry items that we get from the food bank. And we're able to operate choice-based markets with those. Whereas with food recovery, it tends to be slightly lower volume, but more variety, which a lot of our pantry partners like. So that's about all I have for now. Thank you very much, John, and look forward to hearing from everyone else.
Great. Thank you, Tim. And now I'm going to turn to Jody to talk about Rachel's Table of Western Mass.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here. I am Jody Falk, the Executive Director of Rachel's Table of Western Mass. I only have 2 slides, so I will go for it. I wanted to put all of what we do on one slide, and hopefully this kind of does it. Um, we have been since 1992, and we were originally a program of the Jewish Federation of Western Mass. We've become our own 501c3 in 2023. Our tagline is reduce waste, relieve hunger. So we very much are interested in both ends of the spectrum of what we do with surplus food. Um, and we do it with now we have about 500 volunteers, which is pretty amazing, and a pretty small staff, but we're small and mighty. At least we hope we are. So we do this. We reduce waste and relieve hunger in 4 major programs. And we hope, and our goal is to go from crisis responses, which is what we do with food recovery and last mile rescue, all the way to longer term solutions that we're thinking about. How do we actually make a dent in the system in the way that we can, and not without going outside of our mission, so that we might sustain food security rather than continue to try and not have food insecurity. How do we get a positive um, focus here? So we have these 4 programs. Rescue is what we've been talking about. We call it recovery or rescue. And we also have a wide variety of donors, large donors, small donors. We also go to expos, et cetera. We go to wherever we can. Some of our donors are little Starbucks, and some of our donors are really huge CNS warehouses. We have most of it's with our volunteer cars. We do also have volunteers drive a refrigerated van and now a refrigerated truck new this year. And from what I understand, also I use the Greater Boston Food Bank stats that the Western Mass is one of the highest rates of food insecurity in Massachusetts, which is very odd for we're surrounded by food. We're surrounded by these beautiful, gorgeous farms and lots of food around us. So the rescue program has been the one that we've had the longest. We also have a very robust partnership with our Food Bank of Western Mass, where we also drive some of their food from donor to agency. That's a part of their enabled agency program. We're also, because of their move closer to us in the Southern Valley, we also drive some food from their warehouse to northern parts of our community. So we serve 3 different counties in Western Massachusetts. And actually with one of our programs 4. So our second program is purchase program. We also purchase food at different times throughout the year. That is based on what our agencies are asking for, based on cultural traditions and requests. And also donor food, people who want to support Thanksgiving program, for instance, or something like that. We have a gleaning program, and it's really great to be in an audience where I don't have to explain gleaning, but I will say it anyway. It's harvesting from the local farms, and we have several farm partners that we've grown throughout the years. And we've changed our gleaning program. It has been the one that has expanded the most this past year. We had several private gleans, which is our educational program, and that. When we decided, okay, we're going to open this up to everyone. So 1 o'clock on a Tuesday, come to the, next barn over, and there's going to be this gleaning of, such and such crop. And basically, that's where we've grown so many volunteers from all 3 counties, all ages, to come and not only glean for our agencies, glean for their communities, kind of develop a mutual aid network of people come in to glean for themselves. There are certainly, we've done some surveys where people who are coming to our gleans, some of whom are finding that it's really hard to make ends meet, and the gleaning actually helps them as well. And so really kind of flattens the hierarchy. Come, help yourself, help others, help your community. So our gleaning program has really expanded. We do partner sometimes with Boston area gleaners, and I'm all for how many ways can we make things statewide, really kind of join each other's hands, and I'll speak about that hopefully a little bit later. Our 4th program is our GROW program, we're calling. It is actually a program where we support agencies of ours, our partner agencies that wish to have gardens, so they grow their own food. The people who are growing the food, however, are not actually our agency partners. It's a collaboration between them, us, and the people themselves who will benefit from the food. So those people who are going to um, who self-identify as food insecure are growing, are harvesting or planting and planning their own food. And that's our thought about how do we support self-determination? How do we support food security? How do we get out of a cycle uh, of the problem of access, which is the biggest problem in hunger, and do that. So now we have 11 gardens, and those are maintained, and we're going to be pushing them off so they can be. Thank you. I was looking for Jessica's. I saw that for everyone, she had some sort of emoji. I wanted to get a Jessica emoji. So anyway, this is about the allowing people to or facilitating things. And what's really cool about that program is people have gone on who are, let's say, clients of one of our agencies or residents in a agency that we serve, and created gardens wherever they go after that. So that is the ripple effect that we were hoping for. Maybe the second slide, I won't talk so long with that one. Thank you. So you see the same crisis to long-term response. Now, so our impact at a glance. So we, in 2025, distribute almost 1 million pounds of food. And that's a lot for our area, right? And we have about 188 food and farm partners. So that's so the food donors are, again, farms and supermarkets, bakeries, restaurants, mom and pop shops, everywhere we can possibly do it. Some are because of our food bank partnership. A lot of them are not. Our food bank partnership is only a couple of years old, whereas our organization has been delivering and distributing food for 34 years. 500 active volunteers, 178 partner recipients. So we have certain agencies that we go every week or every day or every month. And then we have affiliate agencies that when we have enough, we'll also reach out to. And then we have these mutual aid communities that we work with in our gleaning program. And then we serve basically 3 counties, sometimes a fourth, and sometimes into northern Connecticut or even southern Vermont. I wrote the challenges of, as I was thinking about this panel, what are some of the challenges that I see? Capacity, matching, transportation, storage, and legality or legal concerns are some that I see in the area still, even though there's been so much information, there needs to be more. And the opportunities. So continuing to partner for efficiency across all stakeholders. I could talk more about that later. Better communication and education. That's something that I think folks on this call, in this Zoom call, can help with. And for ourselves to continue to grow our own internal infrastructure to meet the local demands. So I think I've said everything I set out to say. We have amazing pictures, but I just chose the graphics today. So thank you again for listening, and I look forward to the rest of the panel.
Great, thank you, Jody. So I always appreciate hearing these presentations because it's such important work and always really impressive to hear the work that your organizations are getting done and how much is happening. It's really always impressive to me. So with that, I want to turn to a few questions that I've thought about as we think about where do we go from here and what can MassDEP do in this regard, or what can we do with others. So the first one that I wrote down here is, what are the biggest barriers to growing food rescue and donation in Massachusetts? And maybe Tim, if we can start with you, and then we'll work our way around here.
Sure. I'd say at the top would be cold chain infrastructure, so refrigerated vehicles, warehouse, walk-in coolers, um, and on a more logistical level, being able to match the scale and variety of food from donors to appropriate recipients. And there are sometimes that we get offers from, say, commercial bakeries that we have to turn down because we're already getting a lot of bread and pastries and baked goods from our grocery partners where there's more of a mix and we're getting a larger bulk of more nutritious food at the same time. We've found that our partners don't want to just, absorb lower nutritional quality food just because it's out there. And I think, prioritizing dignity and choice, and having an escape valve with, you know, I guess that maybe gets into the one of the other questions, but having compost infrastructure available when we, if there are ever cases where we have too much of one thing or when there are quality issues.
Yeah, and that's something that I didn't really, that connection with compost is an interesting one. I didn't really frame that in any of my questions, but I think that I think actually there it's often a synergistic relationship between food rescue and donation and composting, whereas there's maybe the potential concern about those being competing for the same material. And I think, yeah, I think we often see that's not the case, and they can be mutually supportive. So it's an interesting point. Andrew, I'd like to turn to you next and get your thoughts about this.
Yeah, so we have a lot of different challenges. The main one is that the Cape is so spread out. We have 15 different municipalities across the Cape. The Cape is 65 miles long. In the summer, it can take forever to get from one point to the Cape to the other. In the winter, you would think it might be better, but there's always bridge traffic or repairs and road work. So it just and it seems that, and I maybe this isn't just the Cape, but a lot of our volunteers are very specific over where they're willing to travel and where they won't. And so, and with good reason, because of all those challenges of how the Cape is spread out. So just the logistics of being able to move the food efficiently and effectively, especially in the summer months. We do have some access to refrigerated vans, but again, just needing the time and the ability to like map out where our assets are in terms of who has what for infrastructure that we can use, but then also how to move food more effectively and efficiently. And then just, yeah, the cold storage, the dry storage, land is at a premium on the Cape. So trying to find unique and innovative ways that we can find some land and figure out funding in order to do that. We're really at the beginning stages of even though we've been doing this for a few years, but just trying to figure out the structure in order to get some um, processes and plans in place and some momentum to move us along. But that's really where we are. It's between managing the volunteers and the location.
Okay, thanks. And then I'll turn to you next, Jody, for your thoughts on this question.
Great, thank you. I am going to have a little bit of overlap, and so the biggest barriers, I think, size of donor, and we'll come back of inventory, legal issues, matching issues, as Tim had talked about, capacity and quality, and also we have been looking at how to connect with composting. So size, if it's a small organization, it's tight on staff, tight on time, there's not going to be the interest or the availability to donate. Inventory, there's a lot better inventory, which is great for not getting into landfill. A lot of people are really ordering less, or et cetera, in restaurants, et cetera. But it also, for us, is this double-edged sword of like, well, then we're not getting enough food for people. So that's that. Legal issues, there still are folks, even a local hospital near where I live, that is really clear that they don't want to donate because they're afraid of lawsuits. And we all know that that's, it's just there's not enough strong information out there to some of these to these potential donors that could be there to encourage them. And I know that this is something that you're all working on. And even within that, there was an organization we worked with that was felt there was only one way to store and move food, and that was not exactly what Feeding America condones. And so it was sort of like they wouldn't do it unless we did it their way. So it's a really sticky issue about legality. Matching issues, as Tim had said, timing of a donation matters as to who we can give it to and when we can get it there and whether we have the volunteers to do it. Whether there's storage issues, also capacity of our agencies, whether they can store food, and the type of food is important, and whether the agency is wanting that type of food. Capacity. We have our own capacity issues. Do we have enough food donors, and do we have enough volunteers, and do we have enough times that we can communicate again with potential donors, educate them, let them understand this is a really good thing to do, and why. And because it does take time, it's not timeless. It is something that they need to physically do, and therefore to build into their operations, and it has to be something that's signed on from all levels in order to actually do it. Um, and the quality. So sometimes food is just not donatable. That's where we're looking at where do we take it next? What animal farm or what composting, and how do we then create those very easy bridges? Because again, volunteer run, our volunteers are not gonna sit in the car and brainstorm. They need to know where to go, what to do, and where to take it. And again, some agencies are just really picky about kind of food that they want, and they should be, whatever they need. And we're trying to again look at, for in terms of composting, how do we coordinate with local agencies in order to move food better to the next step in the chart, right, of where food can go. Those are the main things. And was there anything else? Yeah, I mean, it brings up a whole bunch of discussion topics. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to maybe, I just made a note about the legal issues, and maybe on a related note, if there's not exactly legal issues, but if there's any role maybe for legislative or statutory changes at either the state or federal level. So maybe that's something we can think about as we go through our questions. So I turn to our next question here. So this is something we talked about the dynamic of these questions, that there's going to be some overlap and maybe some redundancy in thoughts about each of these questions, but that's okay. I just kind of encourage you all to think about, maybe a particular take on these, if whatever comes to mind. So as we're thinking about the work that we're doing at MassDEP, we're increasingly focused on reducing disposal of food from smaller sources, including places like smaller business generators like restaurants or food stores. This has come up a couple times already. Or even, how do we capture food from individuals who want to donate food, which is a very different source. I'm interested in your thoughts about opportunities or challenges of gathering food donations from these smaller types of entities, and feel free to kind of break off any part of this you'd like to. Andrea, why don't I go to you next, and we'll circle through here.
Sure. So I think for us, a lot of it, I think, is education, marketing, and outreach, getting to all of those small businesses and organizations and helping them to see their part in the food system. I mean, obviously, that's a no-brainer that they are part of the food system, but seeing them as part of feeding their community in unique ways and really being a part. We do have a lot of small businesses that do that already, but there's so much more that can be done. We have a lot of seasonal businesses, and trying to plan and get ahead and say, okay, you're going to be shutting down your business in October or late September. Let's put a plan in place. What can we start to think about collecting, and where can that food go? We have a lot of catering events, weddings on the Cape. So what can we do to start doing that outreach and the planning? Each one takes a lot of time. We worked with one partner months ahead of time, and it was wonderful, and it worked out really well, but it just took a lot of time to assure them that we were going to do everything the right way. And so all of that just takes a lot of effort. So for us, I really think there's so much potential in reaching a lot of those small businesses, timeshares. We talked about people on vacation, doing some collection for people before they jump on a plane and going home instead of throwing everything away. How can we start getting the word out that people can donate to to the organization, the food rescue organization. So those are just how to do that in a consistent way. And I think some of that will come along as we continue to do some strategic planning with our organization. But it's something that it's just time consuming, but it's really exciting too, because once people start learning more about it, you can just see the momentum gain. So we're really excited about that. I think that's pretty much it.
Okay. Jody, I'm gonna bounce back to you and get your thoughts about this question.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I would agree. Education, education, education. And that is on every level. So, and that's again about legality. That's about just awareness that this is even a possibility. Um, and just to get people to step outside their own comfort zone, that that this exists. And then it's also education about what is safe food to donate, right? So when you talk about individuals, and I want to get to my colleague in a second who's just raised his hand, but when you get to individuals, there's some laws about what's possible, what's not possible. Um, I found sometimes this is an interesting thing. It might be that a restaurant is too busy or not interested, or there's disparate knowledge. The other day I was with someone who works in a local restaurant and said, "Oh yeah, there's a lot of food that goes to waste. Oh, let me talk to your people." So I talked to the owner who said, "No, no, that doesn't happen." So it's really interesting to kind of understand workplace dynamics and what's really who's speaking to whom and who wants to admit to what. And that's not something I have the social work background to get into, but it's sort of like it's a really interesting, like, what really is the education needed. There's also, uh, for smaller places, prep time, as I had mentioned before, what they have to really understand what food safety is, especially in a restaurant, from hot food to frozen food. Um, the and I had mentioned before, there was an organization that thought there was only a certain way to freeze food and deliver it, and that's again education. Um, I also want to speak about, we do sometimes ask for individuals for food, and it's not from their own kitchens. It could be a food drive or things like that, but especially our gardens. A lot of people have local gardens, and we do actually invite people for the extra, crop of tomatoes to come and deliver, so we can donate that. We had someone who had lots of eggs one year, and so we worked with them throughout the season with eggs. Jay, it looks like this is my colleague Jay Levine, also from Rachel's Table, and feel free, go for it, Jay.
Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about the sort of the small food donors, particularly restaurants. As this discussion was going on, I was taking a look at the restaurants that we have as food donors, and they kind of fall into a few categories. One is local franchises of a larger organization. We pick up food from Chick-fil-A. We pick up food from, well, we used to pick up food from Starbucks, not anymore. They took that away. But there are a number of those. So you have sort of a corporate structure that can help put together some of the logistics and some of the information that then trickles down to their local places. We pick up from Pride stores, not a restaurant per se, but they have lots of prepared foods. And those prepared foods are already sort of individually wrapped. They may not be, they're already refrigerated. Some of the stuff is occasionally it's frozen, mostly it's refrigerated, but it's all individually wrapped, doesn't take any extra effort by the organization to prepare the food to be donated. Um, for I was going through this, and all of a sudden I noticed that of the sort of independent individual restaurants that we have, the almost all of them are bagel shops. We have like 10 bagel shops. Again, it's something that's easily frozen. You can put it in a bag. They store it in their freezer, which they have already. Very easy for us to pick up. Even if we're defrost a little bit, it's not perishable. Particularly, normally we get it out to places quick enough that we don't have to worry about that. And then there's one other place that, in a way, it fits into the bagel shop model. There's a small chain of stores out here called Delaney's Markets, and they Their specialty is frozen prepared meals, usually individual or for a couple of people. So they start out frozen. And when they get past whatever date they want to sell them out, again, it's frozen and ready for us to pick up and bring somewhere. It's the other types of restaurants, I think, the individual local places who may not have it frozen. They have to figure out how they can take their excess food and packages it properly or freeze it and keep it in their, I think, usually probably fairly limited freezer and refrigerator space so that it's ready for us to pick up. So I think it's that last group that might take the most education and most work, and that maybe for these other places, the more national or even regional chains that may be able to take their corporate structure and get it down to their individual markets, that would be a way for us to rescue more food that way.
Right, thank you. Jay, just one follow-up question for you about kind of the corporate franchise type locations.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that typically, is that dynamic typically more top-down or more bottom-up from a particular location?
It depends. When a couple of the corporate places that we work with, there's a national organization whose name escapes me right now, who has coordinated with some of these larger chains.
Food,
Um,
food donation rescue.
Oh, right, the Food Donation Connection. Thank you. So a lot of those have come to us through them. Locally, Jody, we were already picking up from Pride when you got to Rachel's table, right?
No, Pride was something we picked up my second year there.
Okay. So, but I think that was a relationship with the owner of the restaurants. He had an interest in that. So again, it was sort of
Correct.
top down. And although the restaurant ownership or the the gas station store ownership has changed, the new owners has continued that program. And again, we mostly deal with the corporate folks, and they then bring it down to their individual stores.
Okay, thanks. And then Tim, let me turn to you on this second question here.
Yeah. So in our experience, restaurants have not been a viable source for food recovery in general. And I think, if a chef or kitchen manager is doing their job well, you're not going to have a lot of um, unused ingredients to begin with. I think a lot of the food waste that comes out of restaurants is going to be stuff that nobody would be able to recover because it's already been on someone's plate. So, really, working on education around portion control, and having businesses track the data of what they're seeing not get consumed when they're selling it to their customers. Um, and then, yeah, also if there are ingredients that they're ordering and aren't getting used by their best by date, it's going to be really spotty, whether or not that's ever going to be something that can be used safely by another entity. Uh, so that's and I guess just to flesh out what the program that I talked about, where we were rescuing the bulk prepared food and then repackaging it into meal trays. We saw organically when inflation got out of hand a couple of years ago, there was a sharp reduction in the amount of prepared food that we were recovering from those locations because the managers were under pressure to reduce waste, really take a hard look at their ordering, and only bring into the kitchen what they were going to use.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Interesting thought about, if in a restaurant environment, if you can be successful with food waste prevention, maybe that's the better route, at least for for some entities. So I think that's something interesting to think about. Jay, your hand up.
Yeah, just to address the sort of prepared meal issue that Tim just brought up. We do collect, we have a regular route every week that we pick up through the Food Bank of Western Massachusetts, where we pick up from um, Amherst College. And it is trays of meals that were in the cafeteria, never got put out, obviously, because those can't be donated. And then we've matched those with agencies that have meal programs. So it's not a question of having to break up the tray into individual portions like Food for Free was having to do. So we that's a case where, with careful matching, you can rescue those kinds of foods. We also rescue food, that same sort of food regularly from the Hillel program at UMass. And we do things occasionally where we'll rescue stuff from hotels where they've had events, similar sort of an idea. And again, we bring those specifically to a particular kind of donor, the meal services, who can then use a whole tray all at once. So that's one of those places where if you can match the donor with the recipient, you can rescue a category of food that's otherwise difficult to rescue.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think, Bill, it looked like you had your hand up. Bill Rennie.
Yeah, thanks, John. Bill Rennie, Retailers Association of Massachusetts. And I apologize if you covered this at the beginning, John, but I wasn't able to get right on. But the governor's anti-hunger task force, they started meeting. I want to say it was last June, July, August, and over 6 months or so with a series of meetings and listening sessions around the state. I don't know if and I know that was kind of coordinated with the DAR and EOHHS and DTA, and I think probably a lot of folks that maybe on this now, but as the department, are you in kind of coordinating with them? Because that report I'm hopeful that it gets into a lot of the needs and different things that need to be done to support increased food rescue in the Commonwealth. And I know that the report is done. I think it's still in the governor's office. The final report hasn't been released yet, but just curious to know what the level of coordination with DEP and the governor's office on the anti-hunger task force.
Yeah, so I'm definitely familiar with that group. I haven't participated directly in those discussions, but I think that's a good suggestion that we should certainly look to the recommendations that come out in that report, and that I expect that'll give us some thoughts that we can build on for our work. So yeah, I think that's a good suggestion to take a look at that.
Yeah, I was on the task force, and I know there was a number of the Greater Boston Food Bank and a number of the food banks from all around the state, and a lot of different food recovery groups. So I do think it would be really a good starting point.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion, and if we can save some work along the way, that would be great. All right, and turn to the third question here. If I can get my slides to advance. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we may be getting into some increasing redundancy as we go along, so that's okay. We'll just dig a little deeper into some of these. So my next question is, what do you see as the most significant infrastructure gaps to further grow food donation? I'm sorry, and I'll turn to Andrea this time.
Mm-hmm. I think for the Cape, what we've been seeing is just a place to be able to sort the food and be able to store the food. That is a huge part. We do have a lot of commercial kitchens with our partners that we can use, but I've noticed that I'll bring or our volunteers will bring food picked up from a retailer and bring it to an organization. They can't use it, but they don't have the bandwidth to just pick up their, they're so busy that they don't really have the time to reach back out and say, we can't take it. And we don't want it going back into the dump when there's a wonderful organization right down the street who could take it. So trying to find the time in a way and a space for organizations to only receive the stuff that they really need to receive and want it versus what they just get dropped on their plate and they have to figure out what to do with it from there. So a big part for the sorting, the storage piece, and again, just I guess more like knowing how to connect with all the different partners that we have. And we do everything, mostly direct to the end user, but how can we work more seamlessly all together to track all the information that is going on there? It's a very fragmented system too, and there's so much already being done on the Cape. So how do we really get a good eye and understanding of what's already taking place, how much food is actually getting rescued, so we're not tripping over each other, but to have a more integrated approach with all the efforts that are being done.
Yeah. Okay. And then Tim, I'd like to turn to you next. I know you mentioned cold cold chain storage, I think earlier in one of your comments, so that's certainly related here. But other thoughts about infrastructure in this space?
Yeah, I think the concept of community fridges is one that but it would be great if we could expand that, but it does take a lot of effort. I mean, I think you definitely need stewards, whether they be volunteers or staff of organizations to check on them regularly, keep them clean and organized, and be able to cull stuff that doesn't belong in there, whether it's spoiled or just not suitable. Um, Aside from that, I'm seeing things pop up like the Greater Boston Collaborative Food Access Hub and the work that FoodLink is doing to bring in a lot of wholesale scale foods that are then able to be redistributed to other organizations working with their own community partners is an innovative model. Being able to and they use a database that when an item is added to that, it sends out an alert to everyone in the network. So having that kind of communication and coordination so that even if the collecting agency doesn't have a great recipient match for everything they're getting, that it's still able to uh, get out into the community when it's fresh and good to eat.
And then Jody, I'll turn to you next.
Sure. As I was just looking at my answers, I was thinking it's um, geographic in different ways. There's internal to Rachel's table. There's our our area and the different stakeholders in our area, and then there's actually across the state. So um, internal would be just our own staff time and availability and capacity, and looking at the idea of more corporate partners to help us, corporate partners as volunteers to support our work, because that's we just there's just so much, in a world where there's so much food that's still going to waste, and there's so many hungry folks or people who are food insecure, like that just can't happen. And we really are just, it's like every time we get to the one place, there's more need. And it's just it's almost an uphill battle. It's a really, can be disillusioning. And we just, more and more, is we need volunteers, we need the food, and we need to keep going. So our capacity is one of the infrastructure gaps, and I'm not going to we're not going to grow to this huge organization. We're going to continue to try and work locally with communities and partners to keep it going. Then more regionally, in our area, storage, and I heard that before, but it's cold storage, it's dry storage, it's our recipient agencies having storage enough. We did a glean this past fall, I believe, which we gleaned 18,000 pounds of cabbage over 3 different gleans, and there were thousands more to do. And if the farm had storage, or if we had more storage, or if the agencies had more, there would be a lot more that would have been able to be rescued and to be delivered and to be recovered for people who are hungry. Um, and the region, I'm excited that we're on a call with people from all over the state. We know that there's transportation, there's pallets of food that come into the eastern part of the state, into the Boston port. And if there could be some more connection of how that food could also come to the west and how we can then work with our trucks to then deliver it. We sometimes have done that with Boston area gleaners. They've come, we've met them kind of part way, and then we've taken it to the last mile. Where they've had different hubs, and we've created the spokes from that particular hub to get it out there. I really, I don't know, I think I'm pleading, or not pleading, I'm just encouraging, inviting us to kind of come together as a state, not just as different regions within the state, to really move food so that we kind of equalize the distribution and equalize the supply and demand. And I'm seeing again, I'm excited that I brought my colleague along because I'm a team player, so I love to hear what all the team has to say. And Jay used to be operations manager, so he has a lot to say. Go for it, Jay.
So I don't know exactly if you would think of this as infrastructure, but in this discussion and building a little bit on what Jody said, is that I think there are, in the same way that, for example, the national chain restaurants that can then have an overall structure above that, where they maybe have more time to plan things. One of the new sets of donors that Rachel's Table has been developing over the last number of years, excuse me, is picking up donations from public schools at, before Christmas, before spring vacation, before summer. When I started, I don't think we were picking up from any public schools. Now we're picking up from 5 or 6, I think, local school systems at this point. And, that's the kind of thing that maybe the state, either you folks or maybe the state education department, could help get this idea to filter out down into the individual school systems. It's every town, or maybe not every town, because there are certain towns just so small, they're regional schools, but those are all places where there's food all the time. And I know from my experience, there's always food left over at those times of the year, that most of it probably does get thrown away. And that's something that I think is an area that really could be expanded.
Great, thank you. So now I could certainly ask more questions, but I just want to kind of open things up now for anyone else who wants to offer a comment or ask a question. You can feel free to type something into the chat, or you can feel free to raise your hand and we can go around and call on folks who want to either ask questions or offer comments. So let's see. Oh, Heather, see your hand up.
Hi, this has been really great. Learned a lot and want to make a bunch of connections afterwards. Jay, thinking about schools, we do some work with schools on on their food management. So both donating what they can, well, reducing. And then donating and then diverting. And part of the reducing is encouraging share tables. And so the food that's left over that the kids have to take to get out as of the kitchen as a reimbursable meal, they may or may not want. And then so we're encouraging the share. But at the end of the day, that needs to go someplace. So it may be, I guess I'm looking to encourage schools to do more of the donation of those leftovers, whether it's on a daily or a weekly basis. Is that something that all of you would be interested in, willing to discuss collecting?
Can you give me an example of the kind of thing that's being shared that you would envision being shared at the end of each day?
Uh, Oranges, milk, cheese sticks, the items that are cafeteria provided, and
Hmm.
um, so whether it's Whole Foods, juice. It's not like half a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that the kid brought
Sure.
from home. It's cafeteria provided. And then, so that's the share part. But then, in addition, the school could have like the grab and go salads or parfaits or other items that don't get taken at the end of the lunch period, but are still perfectly good. It's just that they're not going to use them the next day or maybe 2 days from then.
Sure. I mean, that's the sort of thing that we tend to rescue from the Pride stores, is those kinds of items. Pre-wrapped sandwiches, the parfaits, those sorts of things. If there's milk that's getting closer to its expiration or best use by dates, that is something that the model that we have could accommodate something like that, potentially.
Can I add to that, which is, I appreciate that question, Heather. I think again for statewide, which is what my colleague Jay was talking about, education, because there is a place in which we've reached out to Sodexo, some of the bigger companies about that, and then also the individual schools, and it's just a knowledge thing and a time thing. But because we've done that not on a regular basis. We did that mostly actually recently in a school system that it was actually a summer program. So it was run by a private organization in a school. And they noticed that the food that was coming through Sodexo to the school program was getting thrown out and unopened, things like milk cartons and oranges. And then we just did a whole pickup, a 6 week pickup of their program. And we kind of had them put it in the refrigerator. We came the next. We worked out a whole system where we went every day. So it can be done. It's just a question of will and understanding and education, I believe, because there's so much waste. People don't want their milk cartons, and really should that milk could go to people who really want it.
I'm going to stop my sharing for a few seconds here so we can see each other a little bit better, and can bounce back to the slides in a minute. Leah, was there anything in the chat that I missed?
No, I haven't seen anything come
Okay.
through, but yeah, just another invitation to throw it in the chat or raise your hand and ask. And
One thing I'll just throw out there I'm kind of taking as a theme, and I'm not sure where to go with it, but it strikes me that there's a lot of connecting here between donors and recipients and matchmaking and trying to get the right food to the right people in the right place at the right time. Seems like a lot of what you all are working on. I'm just that seems like there's a lot of challenges wrapped up in that. And I'm just interested in your, any thoughts about, are there, I think, at different points, some of you mentioned education, you've mentioned awareness. Are there ways to kind of maybe streamline some of that coordination across your organizations? I know, Andrea, you had your portal that you were working on out on the Cape. Maybe that's an example of that.
Yeah, I think that's our biggest challenge. So I think anything that we could do to help make it an easier, quicker process in order to connect those resources with the end user would be so helpful. I'm not quite sure. We're hoping that web portal that we are building out will help us do that. Instead of, right now it's always a challenge, like in my mind, who's open this day, who can accept it, and how can I just get it there faster, while also keeping in mind our volunteers might not want to go too far either, and and our organizations might not be available, especially when things have a really quick turnaround time. So we haven't really figured out that. We'll get a call from somebody, I think Star Market the other day, it wasn't food, but said they had like 8 huge big bins of magazines. But they needed it gone. They were clearing it, and I didn't want it going in the trash. So just trying to figure out, that's such a unique, specific thing. What do you do with it, and how do you figure it out really quickly? One nice thing about the county government and extension is there's so many different programs underneath extension. So we were able to send that over to the 4-H clubs, and they were able to use it for a project they were working on. And so that's a nice thing about the county getting involved, because we are kind of aware of what's happening across the region that might be able to use these things. But it is a really tricky part. Like, you want to make sure you can keep everything out of the landfills, but then you're also working with limited knowledge and information on who can take what. So maybe more of an onboarding process for us would be helpful to say, when people are wanting to work with us, what they're able to take.
Okay.
We have a model that works on a few different levels. So we pick up food 6 days a week, and the food routes, I'm going to call them, are divided up into a few different types. What we call no-call routes, where we have a particular volunteer, or sometimes people share these routes and switch off weeks, where there'll be a particular donor or donors and a particular recipient, where every week you'll pick up from that donor or set of donors and you'll bring to this particular recipient. Then we have the sort of the daily routes, where we have a roster of food donors that we pick up from each day. And then we have a volunteer role that we call dispatcher. And it's the dispatcher's job to look at that list, call the people who need to be called and say, do you have a donation today? They usually try to get some sort of an idea of the size of it. And then when we onboard a new agency, we get a list of what their preferences for food are. So we have some sense of, this food is likely to go to this agency. So then the dispatcher will call an agency or a few agencies and say, do you want this donation today? And then they say yes, they say no. Obviously, most of the time they say yes. And then the dispatcher then assigns that set of donations to a particular driver who has volunteered for a slot to drive that day. So there's that. And then there's our truck and van team, which tends to deal with the larger donations, the donations that need to stay refrigerated or frozen when they're being transported. Again, those tend to fall more in the sort of a set route type of thing, where, again, you'll pick up from the same roster of stores, and you'll bring to the same roster of agencies. But that crew also has flexibility. Sometimes they'll arrive at an agency to drop something off, and that agent will say, oh, we got a donation of yogurt and it's too much for us. Can you take this and bring it somewhere else? The truck team usually says yes. In that case, the truck team will usually call our operations manager, who will figure out where to send stuff. So, I think it. Sorry, the office is calling me. Hold on just 1 second. But anyway, hold on for just a second. I'm in a meeting. Just a sec. I'll call you back. Okay, bye. Sorry about that. So, it takes in order to match this, it takes a mixture of models to get all of that kind of thing done. But there are ways to set up to try to, deal with your regular stuff, deal with unexpected stuff that comes in, and get it sent out to people. But it takes a lot of effort from staff and a large volunteer base.
Tim, I think at one point, maybe at the beginning, you had mentioned Feeding America, I think, and someone along the line mentioned, I can't remember who mentioned food donation connection. I'm wondering, like, to what degree do kind of national groups like that help coordinate distribution of food? Is that does that layer of coordination sometimes? I guess that would be with national organizations with that are chains. I'm wondering how much does that play into this system of managing donations?
Yeah, I think that helps to ensure an adequate volume for the recovery organizations that are picking up on a given day, because it's not being split uh, too many ways. So, and we work ultimately with both of those. So, Feeding America by way of the enabling relationships with the Greater Boston Food Bank, and then Food Donation Connection manages our relationship with the Whole Foods locations that we pick up from. So yeah, I think it just brings a level of order and fairness to that system, so that we're not engaging in counterproductive competition with other organizations trying to do the same thing.
Mhm. Interesting. Just looking through our participants here, I see some folks from other food rescue and donation organizations, Spoonfuls, Food Link, Laura, I think, is involved with the City of Boston Hub. I might have missed some folks, but I'm wondering if of any of you all with other food donation and rescue organizations, if there's anything that you would want to add to this discussion, either perhaps repeating things that other folks have said, reinforcing things that our panel members have said, or if you have other thoughts that maybe we haven't considered yet. Any takers?
I was just going to bring myself, this is Joni from Spoonfuls, bring myself off mute for a minute just to say I hear so much truth in everything that everyone has said so far and would echo much of it. So I've appreciated the discussion. Thank you so much, all.
And we appreciate you, Spoonfuls. We've always, yeah, the partnership. And sometimes when our truck needs help. Anyway, it's good to be connected and to stay partners with everybody. The co-op, yeah, cooperative partnership.
John, I was just going to say thank you so much for having these meetings because it is so helpful, especially for the Cape where we're really trying to get something up and running. And I'm so envious of all of your programs that are so established. And when you were saying all these different positions, I thought, oh, there's so much potential here. So I just wanted to say thank you. And Heather Billings has been a huge help with helping us find businesses to donate food for us and help give us that structure and support and education. And then FoodLink has been so wonderful to share a lot of their practices and how they've been kind of mentoring us for a while now and really helping us figure this out. Because we learned very quickly that we haven't really found it would have been so much easier to ask one of these other organizations to come on the Cape and do this for us and just extend. But it's a big challenge trying to do that logistically. So we realized we're going to have to figure this out and do it ourselves. And it's just been so nice having the brain power, the thought partners, the experts in the field to come alongside and help us. So just want to say this has been so helpful. So I really appreciate you holding these spaces, John, for these conversations. And I'm excited to report back where we get to in a year from now and how much we've improved since then. So all because of this type of communication and sharing. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I think it's always struck me that this is a very collaborative space, is kind of been my experience with a lot of people interested in shared success. So it's a really interesting place to work. I think maybe one thought from our perspective, getting back to this is from Bill, kind of related to Bill Rennie's comment. It's interesting that I never realized how as like MassDEP or Environmental Protection Agency, I never realized how much we would get into the food donation and rescue space. It didn't ever, we were focused on composting and anaerobic digestion and diverting food waste from disposal. And it took me a while to realize, you know, how much we really needed to kind of engage in this space to really help, especially from businesses and institutions, help, prevent disposal of really good food. And I think when Heather might want to add to this, because I'm kind of going off something she's shared with me through the years, but I think I'll characterize it accurately, but you can tell me if I don't, Heather. There's often a dynamic where businesses may start with a food waste separation and send food waste for composting or anaerobic digestion, which is great. And sometimes over the course of doing that, I think there's a dynamic where maybe they realize that they had more food waste or more wasted food than they thought they did, and maybe realize at that point that there are either donation and rescue opportunities and or prevention opportunities that maybe they didn't see when the food waste was going into the trash before. Is that a fair description, Heather?
Absolutely. That happens a lot because once people start that diversion program and they're training it, kind of the program with staff, the staff are looking at the thing that's in their hand and and then realizing, oh, this is such a shame to be putting this in the food scrap collection. It could be donated, or maybe we don't need to purchase so much of it the next time, or make so much of, that we don't need to make so many sheet pans of X. So it leads back around the EPA food waste scale to donation and prevention. Absolutely. And I want to say thank you so much, Andrea. You've been a great partner as well. We've kind of coordinated on like businesses who have a question about doing this is through the Recycling Works in Massachusetts program, the DEP program. Looking at their waste and then, so sort of tag teaming. Andrea can coordinate the food donation and Recycling Works can help coordinate and connect people with service providers for food scrap diversion. So that's been a great partnership and we'd love to replicate that all over the state.
All right, thank you, Heather. I see one other comment from Shannon from FoodLink in the chat about wanting to underscore the need for reliable funding for infrastructure. So that's good to know. That's one thing that we do hope that along the way some of our grant programs can help support infrastructure needs in this space to at least some degree. So good to hear that comment. Okay, maybe any other, either anyone else who wants to raise their hand, please feel free, but also maybe I can just take a moment to ask, I'm going to kind of close with a few thoughts about next steps. So maybe if I can ask each of our panelists if you have any closing thoughts, anything you wanted to say that you didn't get to say, and then I'll kind of try to wrap things up from my perspective. So let me start with Jody and your perspective. Anything you'd want to say to close here?
I think I just want to reaffirm the idea of communication across the state. I think we have an amazing opportunity to be perhaps experts in our region, but to be coordinating among peers. And I'm looking forward to that and excited to be part of this community in doing so. Thank you.
Jay, anything, as long as we're on Rachel's table, anything that you want to add to from your perspective?
No, actually, I think I've pretty much said what I could contribute to the meeting. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And then Tim, how about I turn to you next?
Yeah, I think, as we look at ways to reduce food waste overall, and especially among some of these larger producers, or I'm sorry, on the smaller end, because if you're talking about expanding the waistband to basically catch businesses under half a ton. And just to clarify, is that half a ton per
It's
what time scale?
the current threshold is half a ton per week.
Per week. Okay. Um, I think doing some outreach and figuring out if they can respond with what they're generating and and the quantities that they are and what kind of assistance they would want to see in capturing that. That might have the consequence of just getting them to be aware of what they're throwing out that they might not have thought about before either. So yeah, that just a thought there.
Yeah, just actually one more. The comment about the threshold brings up one other thought I should mention. Under the current ban, if you're subject to the half ton per week threshold, meaning that you dispose of a half ton or more of food material per week, you do not necessarily have to get down to zero disposal to comply. You just have to get down below the half ton per week threshold. So if you could do that through solely prevention and donation and rescue, then you're in compliance. With a reduced threshold going forward, that may work a little bit differently, but this is too big a topic for the time we have. But the general dynamic is that with all of our waste bans, even those that don't have a threshold like the food waste ban, we don't really practically enforce down to zero. So if you're, diverting or reducing food waste down to the point where you're disposing of relatively small amounts of food waste, that's practically compliance with the disposal ban. So it's just something to keep in mind that we're not talking about, even though we talk about a zero threshold, we don't necessarily mean literally zero. We're just trying to get down to kind of, you know, eliminating the disposal of large quantities of food material. Even when we talk about lowering the threshold. So I think that's maybe a little bit of a nuanced point, but kind of important. Let me turn to you next, Andrea.
So my closing remarks, I think what I would say my biggest takeaway and surprise from even being part of food rescue initiatives in the county is what a feel-good program this is. It's such a win-win. You start talking to people and explaining about it, and the best is even people close to me in retail businesses, and they'll say, "Well, we don't have," or restaurants, "We don't have food waste." And but you just don't see it until you start, or even in households, right? And it's just you don't see it until all of a sudden somebody talks to you a little bit more about it, and then you start paying attention. And then in terms of just what a great I'm all about building community, and I think that's something that the county does really well with building these networks, but and connecting people. But one of my biggest blessings in this whole work was getting to know people I normally wouldn't get to know at a personal level and getting to know them like their store managers. And it really just makes me appreciate all the great work that people do in all different fields. And getting to be able to food rescue kind of just brought together these relationships that normally wouldn't have happened, even in such a small, tight-knit community like the Cape. So it's just been a really great opportunity to be able to get to know more people, see the heart that they have for their community. Cumberland Farms, Heather got us all these pickups through Cumberland Farms, and I have a whole new found respect for Cumberland Farms and their staff and how they treat their patrons. So just getting to have that inside look that I normally wouldn't have. And it's just been a really enjoyable process through it all. And just knowing that people are willing to um, put up with like the bumps and the kinks along the way to figure it out because we're all moving towards something that, is the right thing to do and feels really good to do and work together. So seeing the graciousness when things don't, work as smoothly as we had hoped, but just saying, okay, let's just try it again. So it's been a really eye-opening and great experience. So we look forward to exploring this more as we keep moving forward.
Great to hear. I see, Andrew, I see you had your hand up.
Yep. Sorry for the last minute question. I'm just thinking, like, how, like, my question is how can like the donors get like a monetary benefit sooner? You know, if there is a monetary benefit, then maybe they can, you know, pay to help, you know, cover your costs for trucking, and then and get more of this, you know, donation activity going. And I don't know what kind of monetary benefit the donors get. If there's maybe it's a tax break, and if it is, I don't know if there's an opportunity for, you know, the state to help advance that tax break, so like the donor can, you know, realize it sooner, so then they can like pass money on to like help pay for your trucking. Um, like, I don't know how you guys work, but just trying to think how to like get money to like pay for your trucking.
Yeah, I just would say they do. Any donor could get a tax break, and we send out, especially for our farms, tax letters at the end of the year, and we let people know how much they have donated throughout the year, and they themselves can value it and then use it. The money I don't think comes back to us; it goes to them. But I think it's interesting to look at what kind of reciprocal relationships could emerge.
I know also through the Recycling Works program, I believe there's a kind of fact sheet on potential economic benefits of food donation. Heather or Steve, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can't talk and put it in the chat at the same time, but I will. Yeah, we have a
Okay.
document on throwing away food and money, and it does go through the the savings of um, it's not being thrown away. So there is a small savings on disposal. And then there's also the tax benefits, and we've reviewed that with Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic. Oh, thanks, Leah, for accuracy on the way that businesses can take the tax deductions. And we rely heavily on Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic for their fact sheets, which are awesome. And we share them all the time, particularly the liability protections one, also date labeling. And so there's in this the throwing away food and money, there's also some examples of a larger kind of supermarket and a bagel shop about the the real dollar savings that a business can realize by food donation. And being very clear that it's not food waste. It is edible surplus food.
And is that a state deduction or mostly a federal deduction?
Now you're going to go outside my area of expertise. This is a federal deduction.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking if there's a state deduction, maybe there's something where the state could like advance it to get the donor money quicker to then, so then they could actually pay the for the pickup service.
Yeah.
Maybe that's too outside the box.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thought. Oh, I see there's a comment from Shannon from Food Link. There's a line in the governor's supplemental budget for food donation tax credit, at least for farmers, maybe also for producers. Okay, so there is some legislation underway along those lines.
And the second link that I put in the chat is like the main page that Heather was talking about in for Recycling Works. And it looks like there's tons of great resources on there. So definitely check it out. It looks like Bill has their hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up and comment that there is there's a handful of bills before the legislature that have been, a number of them have been around for a few sessions to encourage the donation of food to persons in need and to establish food donation tax credits for, for restaurants and for businesses that, we're certainly supportive of. That I think, like anything, it's got to go through its legislative process. It's been unsuccessful in past sessions, but certainly something that we continue to promote.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bill. All right, so I'm going to wrap things up here. I'm going to just pop up my slides again. Just talk about next steps from MassDEP's perspective here. So, Leah, can you see that okay? Just double
Yep.
checking the next steps. Okay. So again, what we're working towards here is this document we have, which we call our Organics Action Plan, or we're working towards revising that document with a focus on what we're going to do to address reducing food waste particularly from smaller sources, smaller businesses and residents. So again, as I mentioned in the beginning, we'll be holding a number of additional meetings of our organic subcommittee group over the course of 2026. Again, talking about potentially 6 to 8 meetings that we have in mind over approximately a 9 to 12 month period. And as we go, we'll be starting to think about putting together this revised Organics Action Plan, which is kind of what we did way back in 2012, laying the groundwork for our first food waste disposal ban in 2014. So that's what we're working towards. We'll be having additional meetings as we go here. I'll be in communication about those along the way. Relative to our meeting here today, after we finish here, I will be posting both the slides and the meeting recording up on our Organic Subcommittee webpage. Once we get those up there, I'll send out an email to our list to let everyone know those are available. As always, and as I mentioned earlier, I welcome other discussions in addition to our organic subcommittee meetings. So if there are other groups that want to meet on particular sets of issues or concerns, I'm always happy to have those additional discussions along the way. So if you're part of such a group and you want to reach out to me, or if you just have other questions or comments you didn't get a chance to raise today or just want to raise offline, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be happy to talk further. These days, best way to start is via email. Always happy to have a phone conversation as well, but I'm most responsive via email. So if you have any follow-up thoughts you want to share with me or any requests of me, please let me know, and I'm happy to talk further. I want to thank Andrea and Tim and Jody and also Jay for joining us here today and taking time to talk about their work and share their perspectives on food donation and rescue. I think it's really important to hear from the people who are really doing the work, and in the thick of it, because that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. So I appreciate your time and sharing your knowledge here today, and thank you all for joining. And we'll continue to be in touch and keep our discussions going. So thank you again for joining us. I hope you have a great remainder of your day.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Take care.